Lastly, I'm going to speak about a segment of John Molden's newsletter, Thoughts from the Frontline, that I subscribe to, that I've mentioned to you guys in the past. For those of you that don't know or may not remember, John Molden is a New York Times bestselling author. He's an investment expert specializing in hedge funds. He's the president of Millennium Wave Advisors, which is a financial advisory firm. He is the writer of this newsletter, or puts together this newsletter. He's not like the only writer on it. But it's an economy-based newsletter, economy and investments. And his readership is said to have over 1 million followers, which is like sick. I have a dozen in my newsletter in terms of subscribers, which you guys should definitely subscribe to at spuntoday.com/subscribe. It's free. Anyway, I like it. It might sound like boring, like on face value, like the economy, like who the fuck wants to read about that? But his articles are really interesting. They're written very well. They're not like dense textbook type writing. I think that comes from like him being an author himself, a New York Times bestselling author. So he's able to write this otherwise like dense information in a much more like palatable way. What I like is like the interconnectedness of it. Like he can speak about artificial intelligence and its implications on domestic jobs, and then how that translates into a percentage of GDP and how that will technically affect foreign policy. And he connects the dots with shit like that. And actually one of his newsletters is like, this one is Thoughts from the Frontline. There's another one. If you just sign up to one, like you get them all. I think there's like 2 or 3 of them. Another one is Connecting the Dots, where he does like more like stuff like that, and might speak about like the textile stock in China and how that is impacting the price of Teslas here in the US, or like some like crazy shit like that you would never make a connection to, and like he draws the parallels to it and connects the dots for you. Anyway, in what I wanted to speak about in this article, which I'll link to in the episode notes, which is from, again, Thoughts from the Frontline. It's called The Fragmentation of Society by John Molden, and it was published on October 29th, 2017. There's 5 separate sections to it, and the one in specific that I want to speak to is called The End of Cancer. So I'm just going to read a couple of excerpts from it, and the first one is probably the longest because it kind of like introduces like what it is and shit like that. So here we go. Quote: I was talking with my friend Dr. Ray Takegiku, Chief Executive and Chief Scientist of Bexian Pharmaceuticals. The company is now 15 months into a phase 1 trial to determine the safety of a drug called BXQ350, which is basically a full-on silver bullet for mass tumor cancers. It has so far been a small trial in 4 medical research universities with a limited but growing number of patients who have pancreatic cancer and brain tumors. The results have been very promising. Ray told me about one patient at the University of New Mexico who has a very rare form of cancer and who was given the drug. This is a cancer for which there is no treatment. It's basically a death sentence. It occurs in adults, but more frequently in children. Ray was initially concerned about treating this patient, as the study is about safety and you really don't want to have any issues associated with a safety trial. But the patient's doctor talked him into proceeding, and they began to administer the drug. It hasn't been very long, but the patient is improving and the cancer is regressing. He had lost partial use of his right side, but is now walking and using that side again. He then goes on to say that because it's a phase 1 trial, we don't really have much information about how effective the drug is, apart from anecdotes. And distressingly, the researchers must sometimes stop administering the drug because that's part of the required protocol. He gives us some cancer-related stats, which is in the U.S., 1 million people per year get cancer and 500,000 die. Those are ugly statistics, but they could change drastically within less than 10 years. Cancer could become a nuisance rather than a threat to life. He then goes on to say that, full disclosure, I was a first-round investor in Bexion, and so I have a strong home field bias in wanting BXQ350 to succeed, but the reality is that its success will be extraordinarily good for humanity. And then he says, and frankly, one of the main risks to my investment is not that the drug won't actually work, but that any of several other companies that Patrick Cox and I are currently looking at will actually come up with a drug that is cheaper, better, and faster. Or maybe, as in treating AIDS, you end up with a cocktail of drugs to fight cancer. Here's the sick, promising outlook that I got from this article. He goes, one way or another, cancer is going to go the way of measles and polio. You'll be diagnosed by means of a simple blood test that will be part of your annual medical checkup, and you'll be informed if you have cancer. Next, you will undergo further tests to determine what type, and then whatever the therapy is, it is likely that you will simply go to your doctor's office for regular treatments. In the case of Bexion's drug, treatment will hopefully amount to a few months or less of 3 visits per week, no side effects, and your cancer goes away. That's the extrapolation from mouse studies that have been done, and we'll know more after phase 2 studies are underway, which is happening sometime next year. He also goes on to mention that, and he's able to because it's now public knowledge, that John McCain will be given access to the drug at the University of New Mexico Comprehensive Cancer Center, because randomly John McCain has one of the types of cancer that this phase 1 trial has focused on. And he also actually qualifies for the trial. Now, this specific article was speaking to technology and advancements in technology, both medically and in other areas as well, and the impact that has on jobs. And he's not, for example, just like painting like a rosy picture of, some like wonder drug that's going to get rid of cancer and kumbaya, it's going to be the best thing in the world. But he also speaks about how that will inevitably impact the job market. And he says, he speaks to things like the success of this type of drug beyond the many lives that will be saved, and the significant reduction in pain and suffering of cancer patients and their families. He points out that there's also an impact to the hundreds of thousands of healthcare workers specifically associated with the treatment of cancer, which have relatively high-paying jobs. Then there are all the hospital beds, for example, filled by cancer patients, easily in the many tens of thousands, plus all the ancillary workers that are associated with the care and welfare of cancer patients. He says that the impact of that type of loss of focus in their employment in this field will be mitigated by the fact that there's so much need for different healthcare workers and in different fields that they'll quickly be moved to an associated field. But we can't rule out the fact that there will be an economic impact to a cure for cancer, because there's at least, and this number was given by an estimate by Kyle Bass, an economist, I believe. Yeah, that is at least a $500 billion of market cap in big pharma that will be destroyed by a cure for cancer. And, he goes deeper in the article into that type of stuff. But I just wanted to highlight, the fact that if something like this pans out, and it's, the end of cancer as we know it, at least as we know it, is within, a 10-year span of now, would be amazing. I mean, we all have friends or family and loved ones that we have lost to cancer, and it would just be amazing to see it, even if it doesn't go as far as like go by the way of like measles and chicken pox or like something like that, which I would imagine it would, you know, long term regardless. But even if it was like something like AIDS, that, like as you mentioned in this article, is, you know, you don't really hear of people like dying of AIDS anymore, and they're like on a cocktail of drugs to like get them through it. I actually knew someone personally with AIDS several years ago, and he had AIDS for, I think when I knew him, like almost a decade at that point. And he was like on a cocktail of drugs, like a shitload of pills he would take every day, but that got him through it, you know, that kept him from dying, which AIDS used to be a death sentence, just as cancer is now. And it would just be amazing to see that go away. So, and especially like within 10 years, it seems like so close, you know what I mean? Definitely within our lifetimes, and that would be absolutely amazing.